Part of Paul Hindemith's Matiste Mahler Symphony, the Vienna Radio Symphony Orchestra, was conducted on that new Naxos release by our guest this week, Marin Alsop. I'm James Jolly and welcome to this Gramophone podcast. As well as the Matiste Mahler Symphony, the album contains the one-act opera Sancta Susanna, as well as three dances from another of the short operas, Nush Nushi, the two larger works recorded live at Marin's inaugural concert with her new orchestra in Vienna's Konzerthaus. The first question must be, why Hindemith?
Well, when I start with a new orchestra, in a new city, new audiences, sort of new context, entirely new context, I try to find repertoire that will match their mission and also resonate in a way that might be unique to that particular community. And for the Vienna Radio Symphony Orchestra, it's contemporary music is their profile, and they like to do things that are unexpected, but speak to, I think, a broader theme of art in the world. And that's really what drew me to the music of Hindemith. I'm not often able to program Hindemith in the United States because of box office concerns. And I think he's a very underplayed, underrated composer, particularly in terms of the world we're living in today. I think his music resonates in a very special way.
And your association with the music of Hindemith goes back to your studies with Leonard Bernstein, I guess.
Yes, I first encountered Hindemith actually when I was a kid, because my parents were both musicians with the New York City Ballet Orchestra, and there's a beautiful Balanchine ballet called The Four Temperaments, and the music is Hindemith. It's a piano concerto with strings, and I thought, gosh, who is this Hindemith? That I hadn't really never encountered him before. And so that was my first introduction to Hindemith. And then as a conductor, Leonard Bernstein asked if I would please conduct the Matiste Mahler Symphony at Tangoed. And I was absolutely thrilled. And this was a special piece. I mean, every piece was a special piece for him, but he was particularly enamored and really championed this piece and talked a lot about it and the thematic underpinnings of what does it mean to be an artist in the world when there's so much external suffering, and how do you justify that? And so we had some great conversations, and the piece took on, it's a musical masterpiece, of course, but it also took on extra musical meaning for me. And so it's a very special way to start this relationship.
Because, of course, Bernstein gave one of his, young people's lectures. It was actually the genius of Paul Hindemith. I mean, going back and watching it, he really was incredibly passionate about Hindemith's music and saw him absolutely in that Germanic tradition that starts with Bach and sees him as the end of that tradition with some, of course, incredible names in between. And, he argues that Hindemith wasn't liked because people thought he was atonal. And then proceeds to explain that actually he's not atonal at all, and actually he's the last tonal composer in that grand tradition.
I agree 100% with that. And of course, he brought that to our work together, and it was really quite fascinating. But James, isn't it interesting how these impressions, I don't want to say first impressions, but the fundamental impressions seem to endure, and it's very hard for a composer to emerge out from under whatever perception, even if it's misplaced, because people still today think, oh, well, Hindemith, that's not something I want to listen to. That's the initial reaction. Whereas I think if you listen to this CD, you say, wow, this is some beautiful music.
I think that's probably why he's a composer who really appeals to conductors. Nearly, there's so many conductors, when you look back and see who's recorded, say, the Symphonic Metamorphosis, which I suppose is probably his best-known orchestral work. They've all done it. Apart from the fact it's highly enjoyable music, but it's such beautifully crafted music. You feel here's somebody who really knows his way round scoring and structure and the sort of foundations of composition.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that the compositional skill, but the way he uses the orchestra, the colors he finds, the depth of palette that he has is really formidable. I mean, of course, that's probably a huge reason why he was one of the most successful teachers, of course, in our lexicon, because he really thought about it and he could articulate it and he could implement it always. So I feel that he really is one of the most underrated composers in the 20th century.
And for your opening concert in Vienna, you didn't just give them one piece of Hindemith. You kind of, went for a kind of double dose. So as well as the symphony, you performed one of his 3 sort of single-act operas, Sancta Susanna, which is it's a slightly startling story. But I mean, it's obviously about, I guess it's someone almost rebelling against organised religion in a way. I mean, it's got a sort of slightly Aida-ish ending where she asks to be sort of bricked up in the chapel. But I mean, in a way, that's a slight red herring from what the sort of theme of this very short opera is about. I mean, it's about sort of self-discovery and...
Yeah, I think that adding the Sancta Susanna to my opening concert was... I love these short operas by Hindemith, which are completely neglected. I mean, I've never heard them live, never. And I think that it was very important to me to make some kind of feminist statement in my opening concert. Going to Vienna, which is really not renowned for its support of gender equality, let's put it that way. And I wanted to get that message across, that women need to feel empowered and entitled to know who they are in the world. And whether it's oppression by government, by, the male population, or by organized religion, whatever it is, I think women deserve their voices. And so this was very important to me to kind of have that subtext. How many people got it or not, it didn't really matter. It was there. And I think that these small operas really deserve a renaissance in a way. So I'm hoping maybe this will start a trend.
I mean, presumably, with the Vienna Radio Symphony Orchestra's focus on more modern music, means that actually you can adjust the balance between, the sort of the terrible gender kind of imbalance if you take the whole of classical music. But I mean, if you're looking at a smaller proportion of it, actually the numbers, I mean, they still are bad, but they're looking a little bit better. And if you then, actually looking at music written in the last, say, 5 or 10 years, you actually start to see there are quite a lot more women composers that you can choose from. Are you on a mission in a way to try and get the balance better in the performance?
I've always been on this mission, I think. I don't feel it's motivated from, wanting to put women out there just because they're women. Mm-hmm. I'm very conscious of the fact that being well known as the first woman to do something is really not much of an achievement because, it was a roll of the dice, my gender. So I think that I've really tried to invest in the women composers that I believe in over the years. It hasn't been easy in terms of trying to push the agenda forward. It took some rather, I think, brutal truths being exposed through the Me Too movement to even open up the door slightly to women and to people of color as well. And that to me is both a relief and a real kind of a sadness that it takes that kind of pressure that people don't think, why aren't we representing the demographics of a broader society on the stage? Why are we limiting ourselves always? Even in the classical canon, we limit ourselves. What do we think, from Haydn to Stravinsky or something? It's a very small swath, even within that. So classical music has felt very much like a limiting environment for so many people. And, I think it started probably for me understanding this when I started a swing band, when in my 20s, and I fell in love with a jazz pianist named James P. Johnson, Black American who was writing prolifically in the 20s and 30s. And he wrote the Charleston. He was so long to write for the symphony orchestra and be taken seriously in this realm. And yet he was ostracized and pushed toward popular music because that's where Black artists were allowed. And I took 6 years to find his symphonic music and restore and revive it. And I'm so glad I did because it's wonderful stuff. But that's when I started thinking about these doors that are so brutally shut tight to so many people, and how can we start to break down those barriers? But of course, these are huge, huge questions that I'm hoping our industry is finally at least willing to talk about.
I mean, one of the things that sort of strikes me as a result of the pandemic is that organisations were forced, as it were, just to sort of rub the slate clean and say, actually, let's forget everything we've planned and let's, as it were, do things that we really should have been doing years ago, but let's do them now. So, there's that huge resurgence of interest in Florence Price, which I don't think would have happened if the world hadn't suddenly sort of fallen apart. And all of a sudden you get orchestras, reprogramming, their next season. And actually it looks completely different to what the season would probably have looked like had they just been part of a continuum year on year on year. And I'm looking at, orchestra schedules for the kind of 21, 22, 23 seasons. And you're thinking, actually, I think things have changed. Not dramatically, but there is a definite interest in, music from composers of colour, women composers, women soloists, and just, I don't know, I just sort of feel that in a way it's given the whole industry a bit of a shake.
Your point is spot on, James, that if we had tuned in together, say 3 years ago, and looked at the season programs around the world, and then sort of jumped to today and look at them, we would say, okay, how did this finally happen? But it took these monumental, historic events to really enable people to even move partially off the dime. And, I think as a woman in this industry, I feel that now is the moment for us all to be intentional and vigilant about continuing that pendulum swing. I always am concerned that once people get comfortable, okay, we sort of check that box, then it'll swing back. Sometimes you have to do things with intentionality, but I think it's also important that you believe in what you're doing. Sometimes you can't make people believe in it, and you have to just mimic the behavior until it feels authentic. But I'm hoping that it is a trend that we will see moving forward. I have to say that my orchestra in Vienna is very supportive of women composers. I think always has been. And even on that opening concert where I did all this Hindemith, I featured a brand new work, a premiere by Lara Auerbach. So, I feel almost every concert we do features a variety of composers. And we just recorded a whole disc of symphonic music by a Black American composer named James Lee. So I'm very excited about that as well. It's time to open our ears and be, look, you don't have to love everything, but I would say this about all music, all art. It's just important to experience different perspectives. And if we're only getting, this one white European perspective, then you're really limiting your options.
And do you see your role teaching, which you're increasingly doing more of? I mean, is this all part and parcel of the same kind of philosophy you have, just to make it more accessible and more open?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that's something I've always brought to the teaching studio, but I feel even more passionate about it now. Not only do I want to work with a diverse group of young conductors. But I also want to encourage them to be change makers for the future, because they're the ones that will really either carry the mantle forward or limit it. So I'm constantly talking to them and just trying to show by example that diversity is really synonymous with richness, and it's not limiting at all. It's quite the contrary. And I think, especially through the Taki Alsop Conducting Fellowship, which we started almost 20 years ago. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary next year. Seeing these women succeed and the incredible broad diversity of their nationalities, their experiences, worldwide, it gives me hope. And they're all connected now, too, in a community. So I think if we can build this momentum while we have the opportunity, we really need not to take our foot off the gas, but, just stay consistent.
And your new orchestra is a radio orchestra. I mean, what is the significance of the radio bit of that?
I think it's the brief is very similar among all radio orchestras, that it's an orchestra that is of the day, for the population, for the current artists of today, supposed to reflect the world that, in my opinion, supposed to reflect the world we live in. I mean, sometimes we're a little bit, I think, too cerebral about the whole experience, because the world I live in may be very different from the world someone next door lives in. But I really do believe that radio orchestras are essential, and they're critical to the cultural continuum. They have an incredible history that they can go back and pull from the archives because they've recorded everything. They're disseminated widely. Certainly, the ORF is the leading media distributor in Austria. And so being able to be heard throughout the country, touring around the country, you start to feel that you're really representing the populace. And you can take a lot more chances, too. I mean, this is the exciting part, because you're not absolutely dependent on the box office. So you can be more experimental. You can be more daring. And I think at this point in my life, that's what interests me.
And your home, is it the Concerthaus in Vienna? Is that where you give the bulk of your concerts?
We split our concerts between the Concerthaus and the Musikverein, two the great halls of the world, I have to say. And I love performing in both of them. They're very different, very, very different acoustically, and I think aesthetically, very, very different concert halls. But of course, having this opportunity to perform in so many varied venues also creates an incredible flexibility within the orchestra. Besides the fact that they have this brief to, record, and they're so quick. So I love working with the orchestra, and Vienna it's a very special city. I mean, as we know just from the sort of the tradition and the history of it, it is a mecca for classical music. But it's also a city, I think, that's interested in being part of a future, not just part of a past. And so I feel very welcomed there and very embraced.
And I get the feeling, as I sometimes do in Germany as well, that classical music is respected by the whole community, even younger people who are maybe not that personally interested in it, but they know it has a valuable place in the kind of cultural life. It's like in Berlin, they're proud that the Berlin Philharmonic and all those other orchestras are there, even if they don't personally go and hear it. And that's something I sort of feel in Vienna as well. There's a sort of respect, because you only got to look around. You think, oh my God, that's the Musikverein, that's the Staatsoper, that's the Concerthaus. I mean, it's there in front of you. You can't really miss it.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think, of course, there is that respect, but there's also a valuation that doesn't exist elsewhere. During the pandemic, I mean, our concerts were packed until we couldn't do them anymore. It was sort of like, okay, we've got to take you off the classical music, drip. I wouldn't say it's essential to life, but it's close. It's part of life. And it's a part of life that they value. And as a musician, in Vienna, you feel that you are valued. And I think often in other countries, the question is, well, what do you do for your real job? Instead of that sense of awe and respect, as you mentioned.
One of the dances from Nush Nushi by Paul Hindemith, the Vienna Radio Symphony Orchestra, was conducted by Marin Alsop on that new Naxos release. Gramophone podcasts are free, but if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone magazine, which is packed full of expert reviews and in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases every month. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support, and do look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.